Well, hello, everyone. This is not the Midweek Minutes. This is actually something I've wanted to do to help bridge the gap a little bit in our message series. If you recall, Sunday a week ago, that would be Sunday, October 12th, we experienced a software crash just as we were beginning our live stream worship that morning. We were not able to adjust it to make the correction in real time, so to speak. And so only a handful of people had a chance to hear this message. And as we've gone through this series, Finding Stability in a Shifting World, I didn't want to leave this out. I'm not going to preach the message, but I thought just kind of in a devotional setting like this, to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to hear what I shared with the few who were there for that live streaming moment there in the sanctuary. Again, we apologize for that. This in no way takes a place for that worship moment. I'm not going to try to recreate the moment in the message delivery, but I do want to look at the scriptures and just kind of bridge that gap for you. Last week, or actually yesterday, a couple of days ago, Sunday, we looked at matters related to when we don't feel so well, our health, when that shifts. How do we respond, and how do we look at the foundation of a relationship with Jesus Christ, using that as a lens through how we view all of those things that we face. One of the issues that we looked at in finding stability in a shifting world was what happens when our sense of security shifts. And so here's what I'm going to do. Bear with me for just a moment. Some of this is still a little bit new to me. I'm going to share with you the actual slide presentation too, so you'll see some of those images. The title of the message from a couple of weeks ago was, again, the series Finding Stability in a Shifting World. But the title of that message was From Where Comes My Peace? And we looked at a story in 2 Kings chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, if you want to push pause, grab one, read along with me, feel free to do that. We're going to look at 2 Kings chapter 6 in just a moment. But I wanted to share with you also the images that you've grown accustomed to seeing. We call this the bad house, not because the house itself has any problems with it, but because it's built on a foundation that is always shifting. We're uncertain of the future. People let us down. Our health is always uncertain. Culture shifts, and we talked about that the week prior to this message on the 12th, or that last message prior to that. But this week, the week that you missed, was the issue of security. And when we began this message series, I asked you to reflect on how you felt, some of the things that you thought, or maybe even some of the things that you have said during this pandemic crisis, during some of the chaos that you might have seen on the news, or maybe even borne closer witness to. And when we talked about culture shift prior to that, I said, most of us have at one time or another, at least in these last 7 months or so, or certainly at other points in our life, we look at things and we just say, I'm not real comfortable with that. And maybe it's an issue related to COVID lockdowns and those kinds of things, certainly not comfortable with some of the things we see in our culture and our society and so forth. But we also have probably had the opportunity to ask ourselves the question, do I feel safe? And instead of just saying, I don't feel comfortable with what I see, we may even have said or thought, I don't know if I feel really safe. I wonder where our society's going. I don't feel safe because of COVID. Another thing that we addressed in that message on health, I hope you've had a chance to see that. But you can certainly fold that into this idea of security. I don't feel safe. I don't feel secure. I see things. I'm a little nervous about getting out and about and that type of thing. Maybe it's a financial security with feeling some of the ramifications of the lockdown. And so when our security or our sense of security, if that's been a foundation, remember, all of these things are not bad in and of themselves. It's not bad to be concerned about our future or those around us, our health, our culture, or even our security. There's nothing wrong with this house having a security system and a deadbolt on that door. But when our sense of security is the foundation from which we build everything that is valuable to us, when that begins to shift, and all of these things always do, the things in which we place our security, um, when those things begin to shift, it can cause a problem for what we've tried to build. And so what happens when our security, we can think about the little phrase that you find underneath here, when our security is rattled a little bit, it leads to an uncertain sense of safety, which ultimately really speaks to the sense of peace or lack of peace when our peace is disturbed. And remember, we've tried to counterbalance this concept of building that which is valuable, in the picture of our home here, with these things that always shift, with this image. And that is, out of a relationship with Jesus, God gives us eternal or kingdom life, eternal kingdom relationships, eternal and kingdom purpose. And all of that is built on that foundation of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And it is through this, or in light of this foundation, that the structure that we build, that which is most valuable to us, whatever is hurled our way, whatever changes in culture and security and health and all those other things that we so often tend to make our foundation, when all that shifts, this is solid and never moves. And based on that, when we're thinking about that shifting concept of security and where we feel safe, and when that sense of peace is interrupted, we need to remind ourselves, out of this reality, that relationship with Jesus, that peace is not a byproduct of tranquility. We think of a meadow and butterflies and beautiful sunsets. Those may be very tranquil and might bring a feeling of peace, but it's really not the fruit of peace and what we're looking for. Peace is not a byproduct of tranquility. Peace is a product or a fruit of an eternal perspective. So that brings us back to this. Where do we get that? How can we see that? Do we see an example of that in Scripture? And we do. 2 Kings chapter 6. Now, let's go ahead and go to the Scripture. I'm going to read that to you. It's maybe a familiar passage to some of you, but here we find in 2 Kings chapter 6, beginning in verse 8. Now, the king of Aram, and that is also the king of Syria, that is sometimes phrased as Syria or Aram, it's a kingdom to the north of Israel. Now, the king of Aram was at war with Israel, and after conferring with his officers, he said, I'll set up my camp in such and such a place. But the man of God, and that's Elisha, the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware the passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there. So the king of Israel checked the place indicated by the man of God. Time and time again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on guard in those places. This enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, will you not tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? He thought he had a mole. He thought he had a spy in the camp. None of us, they say in verse 12. None of us, my lord, the king, said one of his officers. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. Go find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. It's interesting. He didn't say, I'm going to send men and take his life. He said, I want to capture him. Apparently, he thought, well, if that can work for the king of Israel, he could be a handy person to have. Tell me what's around the corner, Elisha. So we think maybe that was his plan, to use Elisha and his ability that was demonstrated with the king of Israel for his own advantage. Go find out where he is so I can send men and capture him. The report came back, he's in Dothan, and he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God, when Elisha's assistant, got up and went out early the next morning, the army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city, he says, oh, my Lord. Little L, he's addressing Elisha. Oh, my Lord, Elisha, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who were with them. And Elisha prayed, O Lord, open the eyes of my servant that he may see. The Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Those who had surrounded them were surrounded themselves. Verse 18 says, as the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, strike these people with blindness. He had asked God to open the eyes of his servant so that he could see what was there all along. And then he asked the Lord to, at least in a temporary way, as it turns out, to blind or prohibit the sight of those coming to capture him so that they couldn't see even as much as the obvious. Strike these people with the blindness. So he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Now Elisha told them, this is not the road and this is not the city. You can almost see Elisha's servant and maybe even Elisha trying to stifle back a laugh. Follow me and I will lead you to the man you're looking for. And he led them to Samaria. Now remember, Samaria at this point in Israel's history, the northern kingdom, Samaria is the capital. He took them from Dothan, telling him, I'm going to go take you to where Elisha is. I'm going to take you to the guy you're looking for. And he actually takes them to the capital city. He brings them to the king. And he says, after they entered the city, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. When the king of Israel saw all of them, he asked Elisha, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? Oh, man, this is going to be like shooting fish in a barrel. This is going to be easy. Elisha says, no, that's not what we do. Do not kill them, he says in verse 22. He answered, would you kill men you've captured with your own sword and bow? Put food and water before them so that they may eat and drink, and then go back to their master. So he prepared a great feast for them, and after they had finished, a great feast, not just, bread and water. He prepares a banquet for them. A great feast for them, and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. And the key sentence, that closing sentence of verse 23, 2 Kings 6. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. I mean, that's really what the ultimate desire was. So what the king wanted, the king of Israel, he received some relief from those ongoing raids into his territory. People's lives were spared. There was a banquet. Their needs were met. And God worked in a miraculous way. Well, as we think about that story, in light of that question, from where do I get my peace? Where do I, if peace is not the product of tranquility, this was not a tranquil moment when you see something surrounding you. And maybe in your life today, maybe it's COVID, maybe it's economic results of COVID in your life, maybe it's some of the political season in which we find ourselves, and the temperament of that season, which seems to be a little more harsh than anything I remember. Whatever it might be for your life in your moment, there are days you get up, and I know you've had this in this 7-month season of pandemic. I know with the shifting world around us, it's very easy to get up and you think, oh my goodness, where's my help going to come from? What are we going to do? You get up and you may not address it to Elisha, but you say, oh my Lord, I'm surrounded. How are we going to get through this situation? And it disturbs our peace. We're wondering where that safety and security is going to come from. Well, from this story, we're reminded of a few things. And this is what I told everybody that was there in the sanctuary what I was hoping was streaming, but ended up not being. And hear those principles from this text and think of them in light of that question. Where does my peace come from? It's not from tranquility. It's not necessarily being in a peaceful situation, but having that sure foundation and letting that be a fruit of that eternal perspective that foundation gives us. So the first thing we notice in this situation is that the obvious, in other words, to the bare naked eye, the obvious is not the whole picture. That sense of uncertainty that comes, remember that uncertainty in any category in our life is from our perspective only. There's nothing that ever snuck up on God. Is it ever dawned on you? I heard someone say that nothing's ever dawned on God, like, oh boy, Elisha, I didn't see that coming. I wasn't paying attention, and there they are. No, God had his eye on the situation the whole time. And anytime we face that sense of uncertainty, there is always something more, and we may not see it. We may not see it because we have finite, limited vision. We don't see over the horizon, literally or figuratively. But we know that there is one who has been there. We know that there is one in whom we are trusting, that is never taken by surprise. And in light of that uncertainty, in light of even that sense of maybe even foreboding or fear and concern when we're talking about matters of security, we can look at our lives in much the way that Daniel or the Hebrew children did, or even martyrs throughout the ages. They were faced with something that was very real. And in no way am I saying that, well, they weren't there. No, it was a very trying situation. And in the moment, God calls us to a sense of steadiness in the face of overwhelming odds sometimes. You've heard it said, I've told you, I'm not prone to panic. If you see me panicking, the asteroid is incoming and a certain thing. But I just don't. And then I've had people tell me, well, he who doesn't panic when everybody else is obviously doesn't understand fully the situation, doesn't appreciate how grave this is. But even in the gravest of situations, a sense of battle or a sense of very much a real uncertainty or an overwhelming whether it's the diagnosis that you receive, the economic downturn, the relational breakup, it's very real. But God calls us to a sense of steadiness in that moment. And that is one of the things that Elisha's servant saw in Elisha. That was that moment of steadiness. And we're called to that steadiness, not to be optimistic, but to be confident. God calls us not to simple optimism, but to confidence. You see, optimism says, well, it's going to get better. And we can be optimistic. Nothing wrong with being optimistic. That's a much better framework for than being pessimistic, perhaps, for our sense of well-being. But we still have a reality. We can say it's going to get better. Well, it's going to get better back in the Depression. It's going to get better back in World War II. It's after we got into the conflict. I mean, it's going to get better. Yeah, it got better, but there was a battle. There was a fight. There was heartache. There was hurt. And we were faced with a very real situation. You may feel that too. And that a sense of optimism simply says, well, it's going to get better. It's going to change. And optimism for Elisha or his servant that day would be simply to say, well, they're going to go away. We're just going to hide and wait this out. But that's not what Elisha did. He was called not to an optimism, but a confidence. And a confidence says that God is going to see us through. He is bigger than they are. That is what Elisha's servant eventually saw, is he saw things from that eternal perspective. He saw that those who had surrounded them were themselves surrounded. And we realize that finally, when we allow God to work in the midst of that uncertainty, God often expands our ministry and potential on the other side. Now, I can say to you, whatever sense of unsteadiness that you see and you sense in our culture and our society, whatever overwhelming odds that might be there, whatever uncertainty is in front of you, as we look at it in confidence, we're reminded that we can do so because God is taking us not necessarily around. Sometimes he does. Sometimes God does make it go away, but not always. More often than not, God sees us through. And when we allow God to see us through that time of uncertainty, he often teaches us in the midst of that uncertainty how we can expand our potential of effectiveness for kingdom work on the other side. I mean, remember, the goal was to keep the raids from happening into Israel. Elisha let God do that work. He worked through him. He worked through the king, but it was an opportunity to provide ministry. in a very unique way. They went home. The king of Aram said, I can't fight this battle. They're bigger than me. I can't fight against this. And the raids stopped. And so in the midst of that, Elisha and even the king, who was ready to bring out his own sword, but Elisha said no, they had an opportunity to minister in the midst of difficulty. They found a way to do something that met the needs of someone else. And then eventually that attitude, that perspective opened up the doors for future ministry and a future sense of stability. It wouldn't last, Israel's history. But in that moment, God saw them through and expanded their potential to the other side. He got Aram's attention, and they ministered to the enemy soldiers as they were captive that day. All because Elisha didn't panic. He knew that he could look at the situation from an eternal perspective. And I want to tell you, as a church family, as an individual, again, not to recreate the moment. And on that Sunday, and through this whole series, I've not been able to look at every situation. There might be some for instances that I've mentioned by way of example or illustration. But if you want to think about what unnerves you about our current situation, it might be the pandemic, it might be economy, it might be political landscape, or it might be all of that meshed together. It might be something very acute in your life and what you're facing. In the midst of all of that we're all facing, know that you can have that confidence. You can be optimistic if you want, but sometimes God takes us through rather than around. To take us through a situation like this, we need much more than optimism. We need the confidence that God is going to be faithful to see us through. And that as we get to the other side, there will be an expansion of ministry and potential, the likes of which we could have never imagined unless we have gone through this. And so whatever these next months bring, in any of those categories I referenced, or whatever your life, whatever uncertainty or difficulty or known hardship that you see coming toward you, know that you're not alone. That ask God to open your eyes, not only to how he has you surrounded with his presence, but how he can use you even in the midst of that season of difficulty to expand your ministry and potential in kingdom work. When we have that relationship with Jesus, going back in your mind, I won't show you the picture again, but you've seen it time and again, that the foundation of a personal relationship with Jesus gives us the perspective of life and relationships and purpose in a whole new way. It's eternal, it's kingdom. You've been given that and granted that. Know that whatever life throws at you, none of that is interrupted. Culture, health, people let you down. And yes, even when it seems like we're facing something we should fear, God calls us to that confidence and that steady hand as he takes us through. Know that our prayers are with you in these days. We hope to see you connecting with us again week after week, online or safely regathering in person, Sundays at 11. Join with us. And I hope this word has been a word of comfort and a word of challenge as well. Thanks for listening.